I understand that the dog was a St. Bernard. He's giving up his liquor license for Lent. Perhaps we can introduce this subject by telling you the story of someone in the South who was arraigned before the judge, and the judge said to him, "Sam, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" And he says, "Judge, if you're going to put me under those limitations, I haven't a word to say." And so there are people who believe there are no limitations, that the philosophy of self-expression is always right, and that repression of any kind, and asceticism, self-denial, mortification, all of these things end in a frustration of personality. Now, because the philosophy of self-expression is so very general in our land, may we analyze it and ask, is self-expression always right? In order to answer the question, one must begin by making a distinction. Now, self-expression can refer to one of two things. It can refer to something, for example, that is simple, or it can refer to something that is complex. A thing is simple, for example, when it produces only one effect. It is complex when it produces many effects. Now, self-expression is always right when it refers to something simple. For example, a bedbug has a perfect right to self-expression. So has a flea. So has fire. So has water. So has ice. When you get into something that is complex, and therefore capable of producing several effects, well, self-expression may not always be right. It may sometimes be wrong. Now, let us take some examples of complex things. For example, is a locomotive more self-expressive when it is on the track or when it is off the track? Is a razor more self-expressive when it shaves the beard or when it cuts the face? Or take a cold, a common cold. Now, many people have colds, and you are asked, "How is your cold?" You say, "Oh, my cold is terrible." No, the cold is a cold may not be terrible. The cold is a cold may be very good. You may be terrible as a result of the cold. Because inasmuch as you have the cold now, we're dealing with a certain amount of complexity. And I can imagine very well a doctor being called in, and you say, "Doctor, will you please care for me?" And the doctor says, "You know, as I examine your flu germs, I want to tell you that you have a particularly fine culture of germs. I do not believe that in my life I have ever seen germs in better and more complete development than they are in you. And being a scientist, I am in favor of self-expression. I therefore am going to develop this flu within you in order to study all of the effects. Oh, I know that you want me to cure you. You say that your health is more important. Now, that means I have to repress these germs. Do you realize that? As regards your health being more important, well, Einstein says everything is relative. It's purely a question of relativity. For my part, I'm going to express my love of germs. Is it really that simple? Was the doctor right in being that self-expressive? Or were you right in insisting on your health? Now, inasmuch as we are dealing, therefore, with something complex, because we are dealing with man's complexity derives from the fact that he's composed of a body and a soul. Matter and spirit. And the two do not always get along together. They may sometimes get along together like many a husband and a wife in a home. Not so well. And if you concentrate all the time on the body, well, the soul may suffer. If you concentrate all the time on the soul, the body itself may suffer. For example, have you ever in your life known an athlete, a great athlete, who was also a specialist in mathematical calculus? Have you ever known, for example, a man who became an expert in Hittite civilization? whoever won the American Open Golf Championship. I heard of a college, incidentally, that next year was going to have 3 football teams. One for offense, the other for defense, and the third to attend classes. Did you ever know a very athletic girl who was strong enough to do indoor housework? Benjamin Franklin said he knew a man who developed his mind so very much that he knew the name of a horse in 9 languages, but he bought a cow to ride. It's impossible for us to concentrate on one without the other suffering to some extent. It has been said, you know, that if a priest plays golf under 80, a score of 80, there's something wrong with his priesthood. If he plays above 80, there's something wrong with his golf. Now, inasmuch as we are very complex, we are to some extent like a man on a teeter-totter. Long time since I've drawn a man for you, and I've not improved one bit in 4 years. Not a particle. Now, it happens that when, for example, a man represses his love of self, that his sense of solidarity and community goes up. Many a wife has said, for example, of a drinking husband, he's so wonderful when he doesn't drink. So if he represses drink, there's an elevation of his home life. Take, for example, going to a picnic. If you repress the ants, you've got a good picnic. Who was it that said, denied that ants were the busiest creatures in the world and the hardest workers? He said they weren't hard workers at all because he always saw them at picnics. If we repress, therefore, the flesh, it follows that the spirit is going to be elevated. I believe, for example, that every single person in the world has actually got just so much energy. Now, not everybody has the same amount of energy. Some have tremendous powers. And if these powers go in the direction of evil, they're going to do a great deal of harm in the world. If they go in the direction of good, they will be benefactions to humanity. Now, let us take, for example, a person who has, say, not very much energy, say 10 ergs of energy. There's 10 ergs of energy. And he goes in the direction of virtue. Well, suppose he turned around and went in the direction of vice. How vicious would he be? The chances are he'd be just about that vicious. I'll take a person who has much more energy. That particular person goes in the direction of virtue, produces a great quantity of it. That person went in the direction of vice, you would indeed be very vicious. There, I believe, is the great difference between Lenin and St. Francis. I mean Lenin, who introduced communism into Russia. If Lenin had gone in the direction of virtue, instead of hate, violence, and revolution, he would have been a St. Francis of Assisi. And if a St. Francis of Assisi had gone in the same direction of Lenin, he would have been a Lenin. Almighty God can deal with people who have a great deal of force and passion. That was one of the reasons, I think, why he loved Paul. Paul could hate. Not simply because Paul could hate, he had a tremendous capacity for love. The passion of Mary Magdalene was never killed. The passion of Mary Magdalene was just simply turned into another direction. And very fittingly, therefore, she's been called the 13th apostle. The 13th apostle simply because she has done so very much good by turning all of this energy around. The little flower, now the little flower is not LaGuardia. The little flower was the saint, Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa said that if she had followed her passions and had not in some way repressed that which was evil within her and had not responded to God's grace, she probably would have been one of the most evil women who ever lived. That's easy enough to understand. In other words, you never have a self-expression of something without a repression of something else. You never have a repression without a self-expression. That's why it's ridiculous to say of complex beings that self-expression is always right. If you put heat into a room, you repress the cold. Elevate yourself in the direction of goodness, you must depress vice. There must be some kind of asceticism and mortification and self-discipline. When then is self-expression right? Well, self-expression is right when it is directed to that which is the highest in our being. For example, when the mind is directed to truth, when the will is directed to goodness, when the body is more important than the raiment, and the whole being is directed to God, where the personality is also directed to its duty. And self-expression is always to be praised. And then it aids in what is called self-possession. Otherwise, we are possessed by something that is outside of us. And that is why, incidentally, our blessed Lord said, if your eye scandalizes you, pluck it out and cast it away. If your hand scandalizes you, cut it off and cast it away. It was not that our blessed Lord recommended an incomplete body, but rather he said sometimes that which is lower and base will stand in the way of that which is higher. And just as a ship in a storm at sea must be prepared to sacrifice its cargo, so too we must be prepared to sacrifice the lower things in order to possess the higher. That is why all of our games are made of obstacles. Do you not think it would be far much easier, for example, for a pole vaulter to run under the pole instead of going over it on a pole? Wouldn't it be much easier for basketball players if the baskets were down about 6 feet? Take, for example, golf. There's rough, and then the sand traps. The sand traps. I remember some years ago, I was in the Sahara Desert, great expanse of sand, and the guide said to me, he said, do you know what that is? I said, sure, I know what it is. But where's the green? That was the only part of the golf course I knew. All right, now we've been saying that in order to express the best of our personality, we must in some way mortify that which is lower. It may be objective. Then you're opposed to pleasure. Then we are not to have a good time. Then the long face is recommended. Then you pervert life. It may be objected. And you begin to take a pleasure, really a pleasure in giving yourself pain. Is that true? No, those who make that statement, first of all, they do not understand what real asceticism, mortification, and self-discipline are. Remember that our blessed Lord said, when you fast, wear not a long face. anoint your head, wash your face, appear to men not to fast. It is also worth observing, and this is interesting. Suppose I just ask you the question. Can you ever recall in the gospel where our blessed Lord ever sang, now he came on earth primarily to die, to offer himself for the sins of the world. When did he sing? The night that he went out to his death. It was the only time he ever sang a song. Was that denying pleasure? Christian asceticism is not the same as the Oriental asceticism that sits on spikes and walks on fire. Why? Because that type of asceticism considers mortification and pain as an end in itself. It is not an end in itself. And if you make it an end in itself, you are perverting it. God takes no glory in pain as pain. And mortification as mortification. What is the inspiration of it then, if it is not just the seeking of self-restraint for the purposes of self-restraint? Well, the reason for all asceticism and mortification is love. Love. What a man loves is always the measure of his happiness. No man ever made an affirmation of love without at the same time making a negation of something else. When we love something, we are willing to dispense with all that stands in the way of that which we love. That is why, for example, a man who loves vice cannot bear the talk of religion. His love is elsewhere. The man who loves virtue is repelled by vice. See how many lives are changed when a new love comes into them. For example, a baby in a home. Look at all the sacrifice a baby inspires. Mother and father, the husband and wife would certainly never get up at 3 o'clock in the morning just for the fun of it. And maybe it was the first time that maybe the husband ever got up at 3 o'clock in the morning for the sake of a bottle, but he gets up. And they stay at home at nights. They deny themselves certain clothes and even food in order that this new life of theirs may prosper. It was love that inspired the sacrifice. When a man loves a woman, he gives her a ring of gold. Why? It represents a sacrifice. The day that men forget that love is synonymous with sacrifice, they will ask, what kind of a cruel and ruthless creature was that woman to have asked for a ring of gold instead of tin? It's the day that men forget that love is synonymous with sacrifice, they will ask, what kind of a God is it that asks for mortification and self-denial? When young people are in love, one will ask the other, do you like me in red? Maybe the girl will say to the boy will say to the girl, how do you like my hair? Do you like it when I have my hair standing on end like frills upon the fretful porcupine? Would you rather have my hair brushed back? Why? Simply because one wishes to satisfy love. Now take, for example, dieting and fasting. What's the difference between dieting and fasting? You lose 20 pounds either way. Materially, there's no difference. You diet simply because you love your body. You fast because you love your soul. That's the only difference. The only way, therefore, we can show love of God is simply by getting rid of those things that weigh us down and prevent the flight to God. Why not, therefore, for example, when season of Lent rolls around, we'll give up the cocktail. Send me the 50 cents now, send it to the poor of India. That's a good idea. Give up one package of cigarettes. Give up one package of cigarettes a week. Send me the 25 cents now, send it to 80,000 of our lepers that we're caring for. Just give up one movie a week. Now send it to some of the refugees in Vietnam. And then you'll show a certain amount of love. This is the world problem, actually. I'm making it very simple. But the difference between the civilization of the West and the civilization of the East is this. This is our Western civilization. We have a love without sacrifice, without self-restraint, without any mortification. Communism, on the contrary, is a sacrifice without love. A love without sacrifice is what? A love without sacrifice is sentimentalism, romanticism. It is softness. It is the rotting of our nation. What is a sacrifice without love? It is violence. It is tyranny. It is hate. It is the totalitarian state. We have to be aware of this, reminding ourselves of what Toynbee said, that of 19 civilizations that have perished from the beginning of the world until the present time, 16 have perished from within. They died of softness. It could very well be that in a struggle just on the natural order alone, that Russia might be stronger because it believes in discipline, believes in sacrifice, believes in a certain amount of negation, self-negation in order to attain its ends. But that must not be so, and that will not be so, provided we who know something about the cross in our civilization will introduce self-discipline, mortification, self-restraint in our home, in our nation, in our schools, that we may bring peace to a tortured world. Bye now, and God love you.
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved priests in church history. He wrote 96 books and hundreds of articles and columns. He broadcast numerous radio and TV programs. People from all faiths watched him on television because he spoke to every man. They always waited with joy for his goodbye, his blessing, God love you. It continues to give us joy and memory.
Friends, the few minutes before television program begins are always moments of tension. There's a countdown and one is always waiting for the cue to start. It reminds me of a woman in an Arkansas town, a very small town. She was trying to crash the society in this village, but her husband was not very social, so she kept him upstairs with instructions that he was not to come down to the tea under any circumstances. She invited in the ladies, and she was charming them at tea, And her efforts were just about crowned with success when a voice was heard from upstairs. It was the husband, and he was saying, "Ma, there are only clean towels in the bathroom. Is it all right to start one?" So we get the cue and start a television show. And this one is about America. Sometimes the Europeans make great fun of us. This really and truly happened to a friend of mine who was studying in Switzerland. And it seems this American had gone over for his first visit to Europe. And my friend in Switzerland, who was an American, said, "Well, how do you like Europe?" "Oh," he said, "I don't like anything about it." He said, "They're not up to date. They do not have the latest gadgets. The television not in the hotel rooms." And then he said, "Buildings are old." He said, "There are churches here that are over 1,000 years old." And then, "Dirty. I don't find anything beautiful here." My American friend said, "Well, don't you think Switzerland is beautiful?" He said, "Take away the scenery, and what have you got left?" There are so many things that we take for granted now that could not be taken for granted some years ago. For example, our next meal. When the pioneers had to go out to shoot it. Water. But now we take everything for granted. Light, heat, transportation, television, trains and planes. We take our friends for granted. Take people for granted. And we take America for granted. And there is going on at the present time a decline in patriotism. And in order to revive it, let me tell you some of the glories of America. I'm going to mention three. The first is the origin of our rights and liberties. Secondly, the great value that we put upon the human person. And then thirdly, what America's done for the world. First of all, the source of our rights and liberties. Where, for example, do I get the right of free speech here? Whence comes freedom of press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion? There's an audience here in this studio. They are an assembly. Whence comes the right of assembly? Don't you think that our founding fathers had to ask themselves these questions? Well, where do our rights come from? And liberties as well. From the state? If the state gave our rights, the state could take them away. Does the federal government give us our rights and liberties? If the federal government gave us our rights and liberties, the federal government could take them away. On March the 15th, we feel it takes almost everything else away and might take away our rights and liberties. Our founding fathers had to ask themselves these questions, and they searched about for some basis and some ground of our liberties. And they looked to one theory that was being held in Europe at the time, namely that rights and liberties come from Parliament. Founding fathers rejected that. Then they considered another theory, that they come from the will of the majority. And rightly, they refused to accept that view. They wanted a country in which rights and liberties did not come from the will of the majority in an election. They wanted a country in which the majority would be the custodian of minority rights. And they finally found the source of rights and liberties, and they set it down in the second paragraph of our Declaration of Independence. It is a self-evident principle that the Creator the Creator, has endowed man with certain unalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, our rights come from God. And therefore no one can take them away. That's very different from any theory that might exist in a totalitarian system. This is why we call now all of our rights and liberties inalienable. The Constitution puts it unalienable, but the meaning is the same. Now, if our rights came from a party, then the party could destroy them. And so we have in our Constitution, Article 9. And Article 9 of the Constitution states, when the Constitution grants rights and liberties to the citizens, it must never be assumed that the people have no other rights than those granted to them by the Constitution. In other words, simply because we have certain rights, we must never think that we have them because they're in the Constitution. No, we have them because they're divinely given. And we do not have to wait for all of our rights and liberties in the enumeration by a Bill of Rights or the Constitution. See our country as theological foundations. In other words, our Declaration of Independence is a declaration of dependence. We are independent because we are dependent on God. If we wish to keep our rights and liberties, or rather our trees, we have to keep our forest. If we wish to keep our light and heat, we must keep our sun. If we wish to keep our perfumes, we must keep our flowers. If we wish to keep our rights and liberties, we must also keep our God. Piety and patriotism go together. That's the first glory of being an American. And then there's another. And this second glory has to do with the value that our government puts upon the human person. Have you ever noticed how our Constitution begins? It begins, you see, no matter what I talk about, my angel cleans my board for me. Even though it's on the Constitution, he still works faithfully. Now here is the way our Constitution begins. We, the people, decree and ordain a Constitution. Who are people? What makes people? Persons make people. What is a person? Person is someone who answers the question, who is it? A person is one who has rights and liberties, even though he is not useful, like a baby or a sick person. But above all, a person is one who cannot be replaced, like your mother, father, wife, husband, so forth. And a person is one who is self-determined. In other words, a person is one who has a right to go in and look at 20 pair of shoes in a shoe store and not buy a one. The determination comes from inside oneself, not from the outside. One is not pressured. Persons are not the same. Here I'm going to become technical for a moment. Persons are not the same as individuals. When you go to the store to buy oranges, you say, well, I don't like that orange. Put in another. But you can't say that about persons. A mother who has 5 children can't say, oh no, I don't like that one. Give me another one. She has it. So individuals are very often just things. Now, our Constitution states that we are made up of persons, and persons in community constitute people. This has great bearing in the politics of the world today. What's the contrast? Of what does communism speak? People? No. Masses. Who are masses? They're persons who began to be individuals, who lost all sense of responsibility, and then began to be amalgamated into a mass. And all the direction of the masses comes from outside of the persons. They are not self-determining. It's the party that determines. It's the dictator that determines. We are not masses. We are people. One can beware of anyone who speaks. Therefore, the American nation is being made up of masses. Karl Marx, who founded communism, said, the individual has no value, the person has no value, except he is a member of the Communist Party. If he's not a member of the party, he has no value. We say he has value independent of any party. I remember some years ago, Haywood Broun, the great journalist, told me of a friend of his who was a cartoonist for the Daily Worker, which was the communist daily in New York City. And this cartoonist had developed cancer and was unable to work. And he was living in great poverty. And Broun, who had a profound love of humanity, went to the Communist Party of New York and asked them if they please wouldn't do something for this man who had dedicated his whole life to them and has used his talents in drawing cartoons for their paper every day. And the party said to Broun, he doesn't exist anymore. He no longer has value for the party. Therefore, he's of no importance. We cannot help him. The greatness of America, therefore, is its belief in the value of a man. That's why we're interested in just one citizen who might be taken prisoner in another country. And where does this stem from? It stems from, after all, the Christian tradition. One wonders if really the Christian part of democracy was not grounded and founded on that day when our blessed Lord was unfurled like a wounded eagle on the cross, and he turned to a thief on the side of him and addressed him in the second person singular, saying, "This day thou shalt be with me in paradise." He called his sheep by name. Everyone had a value because he was a person and therefore bore the image and likeness of God. This is the second glory of being an American. And the third and final, though there are more, but we do not have time to develop them all, it's our relationship to the rest of the world. Look at what we have been to the world since our beginning. The very beginning of our national history was one in which the United States was a sanctuary to the persecuted peoples of the world. In other words, those who were suffering from any kind of intolerance could come to our shores. And that still is true. Just as there was a ring on the door of certain churches in the Middle Ages where a criminal was pursued by law could have recourse. If he touched that ring, he was immune from civil prosecution, threw himself upon the mercies of God and the church. And we've been that sanctuary to peoples of other lands. And then we became an arsenal. We were an arsenal in 2 world wars. And we did not gain 1 inch of territory. Nor did we ask for it. Very few instances will you find in history in which a nation took hold of the enemy immediately after the war and lifted it up. Who became the strong nations after the war? The defeated ones. Japan, Germany, Italy.
On the frost, echoes in the light.